Normandy, France, June 1944. The rain had just stopped. The earth was slick with mud, churned by treads and boots. From the hedgerows came the low metallic growl of engines, German panzers advancing through narrow country lanes. Inside one of them, the air was thick with oil and sweat. The tankers felt invincible. Their armour was 2 inches of hardened steel, forged to shrug off rifle fire and shrapnel. Outside, unseen in the hedgerow's shadows, 3 American infantrymen crouched in silence. One of them held something new. A long green tube, light enough to rest on his shoulder. No recoil, no armour-piercing bullet. Just a hiss. The panzer rounded the bend. The soldier steadied the weapon, exhaled, and pressed the trigger. A streak of white smoke burst forth, a rocket, spinning, whistling, slamming into the tank's flank. For a brief second, nothing. Then, a blinding flash. The armour blistered, melted inward, and the beast stopped moving. The crew never saw what hit them. From that day, the legend of invincible German armour began to fade, and the strange weapon that changed everything had a name whispered with disbelief: the bazooka. When war erupted across Europe in 1939, one machine came to symbolise the unstoppable might of Hitler's new army: the Panzer. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, relied on speed, coordination, and armoured spearheads that smashed through lines before defenders could react. The Panzer IV and the Coyote opened the campaign. Then came the Panzer III and the IV, heavier, deadlier, refined with each conquest. By 1940, during the fall of France, Allied soldiers learned a cruel truth. Rifle bullets bounced harmlessly off German armour. Anti-tank guns, heavy and cumbersome, had to be dragged into position, often too late. The German advance was relentless, their panzers cutting across Europe like a knife through paper. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it faced the same problem the British and Soviets had already discovered. Infantry could hold ground, but could not stop tanks without artillery, and artillery couldn't keep up with fast-moving battles. Soldiers needed something else, something small enough to carry but powerful enough to pierce armor. The challenge was physics. Armor thickness was rising faster than gun technology could counter it. A rifle round could dent a tank's plate, maybe chip it, but not penetrate. Engineers studied shaped charges, explosive cones that could focus energy into a narrow jet capable of cutting steel like a blade. But no one had yet built a weapon light enough for a single soldier to fire such a charge effectively. In the early years of the war, American troops improvised. They used Molotov cocktails, gasoline-filled bottles hurled at engine grills, and magnetic mines placed by hand, methods that demanded suicidal bravery. In the deserts of North Africa, US and British forces learned quickly what it meant to face the Panzer III and Panzer IV under the blazing sun. Infantry scattered as the tanks rolled forward, firing shells that shattered cover and morale alike. Reports from the front reached Washington with grim consistency. Infantry helpless against armour. It was a sentence no general wanted to read. Inside the US Army Ordnance Department, a handful of engineers began experimenting with rocket propulsion. The goal, a small, self-contained projectile that could carry a shape-charge warhead far enough to be useful, without recoil, and without weighing down the man who fired it. Among them was Colonel Leslie Skinner, an ordnance officer who had already been testing rockets for aircraft use. The idea of mounting such a rocket in a simple launch tube began to take shape. It would need no gunpowder shell casing, no heavy breech, no complex mechanism, just a tube, a battery, and a firing trigger. By mid-1942, on a quiet test range in Maryland, the first crude prototypes were assembled. They were little more than welded pipes and spare parts, but when fired, the rockets worked. The shaped charge punched through a test plate of armor with terrifying efficiency. The test observers, stunned, called the weapon ingenious. It was still rough, still experimental. But a spark had been lit. The concept of a man-portable anti-tank rocket, something that could allow a foot soldier to destroy a tank, had finally become real. That crude launcher would soon be refined, standardized, and given an informal nickname that captured its odd tubular shape. Someone said it looked like a musical instrument, a long brass horn played by a comedian in an old vaudeville act. They laughed. They called it the bazooka. The laughter would not last long, because once this weapon left the laboratory and entered the battlefield, it would change how every tank crew in Europe thought about safety. The first true bazooka, officially designated the M1 rocket launcher, was delivered to US forces in the summer of 1942. It was a crude device, a 2.36-inch tube just over 5 feet long, firing a fin-stabilized rocket fitted with a shape-charge warhead. The rocket carried barely 1.5 pounds of explosive, but its focused jet could pierce 3 inches of steel armor. For a weapon weighing less than 15 pounds, it was revolutionary. It entered combat for the first time in North Africa during Operation Torch. American troops, green and inexperienced, faced the seasoned Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. The Panzer III and IV ruled the dunes, their long-barreled 50mm and 75mm guns outmatching Allied armor. Yet among the equipment unloaded from Allied ships at Oran and Algiers were boxes marked Rocket Launchers M1. Reports trickled back. When fired correctly, the weapon could stop a tank cold. When fired poorly, especially against angled armor, the rocket sometimes glanced off or failed to detonate. Dust and sand fouled the contacts. But when it worked, the results were devastating. German crews caught inside stricken tanks described an instant of light and heat, the armor blistering inward, and men stunned by the sudden furnace-like blast. The Germans took notice immediately. After capturing several intact launchers in Tunisia, they sent them to Berlin for examination. Within months, German engineers had copied the design and enlarged it to 88mm caliber, creating the Raketenpanzerbüchse 43, nicknamed the Panzerschreck, literally tank terror. It was heavier, bulkier, but deadlier, a testament to how impressed the Wehrmacht had been by the American idea. For Allied commanders, the bazooka was a weapon of liberation and limitation at once. It gave infantrymen the power to fight armor directly, something unthinkable just a year earlier, yet it also revealed how quickly the enemy could adapt. Armor plating on German tanks thickened again, and side skirts called Schürzen were added to absorb or deflect shape-charge blasts. Still, the concept was unstoppable. The bazooka appeared in every major theatre, from Italy's mountain passes to the jungles of the Pacific. It was simple enough for a new recruit to learn within minutes. It needed no special ammunition beyond its rockets, and its backblast, though dangerous, could be managed in open air. In the ruined streets of Cassino and Anzio, soldiers discovered the bazooka's second purpose, clearing fortified positions. The shaped charge that could melt tank armor could also blast open bunkers and concrete pillboxes. Infantry squads began to see it not as a tank killer alone, but as a versatile tool for breaking through anything that stood in their path. The weapon evolved rapidly. The M1A1 improved reliability with better wiring and contact points. Later versions, the M9 and M9A1, used a collapsible tube and improved sights. Each version reflected lessons paid for in blood, tested under fire. By 1944, as Allied planners prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the bazooka was a standard issue. Tens of thousands were shipped to England, their tubes stacked in warehouses, ready for the assault that would decide the war in Europe. Few could yet imagine how vital they would become. In the hedgerows of Normandy, tanks and infantry would fight at ranges measured in yards, not miles. Every lane, every farmhouse, every roadside ditch could hide a soldier with a shoulder-fired rocket. The Germans had no idea what awaited them in those fields of bocage. The bazooka's power came not from brute force, but from precision physics. Its warhead wasn't designed to explode like a grenade or shatter armor through impact. Instead, it used a shaped charge, a carefully engineered cone of copper and explosive that focused all its energy into a single, needle-like jet when detonated. When that jet struck steel, it didn't just break it, it melted through it. Temperatures reached over 5,000 degrees Celsius, turning armor into liquid metal in a fraction of a second. What followed inside a tank was chaos. Superheated fragments ricocheted through the interior, igniting ammunition and fuel, killing or wounding the crew before they could even understand what had happened. To the German tankers who had once trusted their thick steel shells, it was a nightmare come alive. The very armor that had protected them now became their coffin, and for the infantrymen wielding the bazooka, the weapon felt like holding lightning, terrifying but empowering. This wasn't the age of the bullet anymore. It was the age of chemistry, geometry, and invention. A silent war of engineers fought long before the first trigger was ever pulled. Before the bazooka, tanks ruled ground combat. Infantry moved cautiously behind them, unable to challenge armor directly. The arrival of a portable anti-tank rocket reversed that hierarchy almost overnight. In North Africa, Italy, and then France, infantry squads began developing new tactics. The two-man bazooka team, one gunner, one loader, operating in ambush pairs. They waited in drainage ditches, inside farmhouses, or among the hedgerows of Normandy. The first shot was everything. Once the rocket was fired, the smoky backblast gave away their position, and survival depended on movement, stealth, and timing. Tanks that once advanced confidently now slowed at every crossroad. Every shadow could hide a weapon capable of ending them in a single strike. The German doctrine of armoured spearheads began to fracture, its momentum disrupted by the growing presence of small, lethal teams of infantry armed with rockets. The bazooka's range, around 100 yards effectively, forced courage and closeness. To fire it, a soldier had to face a tank almost point blank. He had seconds to aim before being spotted and only one chance to hit. Yet thousands of soldiers took that chance. At Normandy in the Bocage country, these tactics became essential. Tanks and infantry moved through a maze of earthen walls and narrow lanes. Visibility was measured in meters, not miles. The bazooka's short range, once seen as a flaw, became its advantage. From behind the thick hedgerows, American troops waited for the rumble of tracks, and when the muzzle flashed, it was too late for the tank crew to react. To the average infantryman, the bazooka was more than a weapon. It was liberation. Before its arrival, facing a tank meant helplessness. Soldiers could do nothing but dive for cover, pray for artillery support, or hope the tank ran out of fuel. But the first time they fired the bazooka and watched armor crumble, everything changed. In letters home, soldiers described the feeling. "It's like David with Goliath," one wrote after the Sicilian campaign. "Only this sling spits fire." But power came with fear. The bazooka's backblast could be deadly in confined spaces. Firing from inside a building risked suffocation or burns. The rocket's trajectory could curve or wobble. In damp conditions, it sometimes failed to ignite. Every launch was a gamble between victory and explosion. Still, soldiers learned quickly. They named their weapons, painted them, carried extra rockets like trophies. The weapon's crude simplicity, a metal tube, a battery, a trigger, was deceptive. In those few pounds of steel lay the ability to turn the tide of a battle. For the first time, an infantryman could destroy the most feared machines on Earth with his own hands. The bazooka wasn't just a weapon, it was an idea. That no armor was absolute, no machine untouchable, no empire invincible. And that realization would soon strike the German tank crews themselves, when the hunter became the hunted. At first, German tankers dismissed reports of American soldiers destroying panzers with shoulder-fired rockets. They called them fairy tales. The idea seemed absurd. How could a handheld tube compete with 50 tons of steel and a 75mm cannon? But on the Eastern Front, they had already seen what shaped charges could do. Soviet infantry were using primitive anti-tank rifles and magnetic mines, but nothing like the weapon now appearing in Allied hands. By mid-1943, reports from Italy began to confirm the unthinkable. German Panzer IVs and Stu-Gs were being destroyed by infantry alone. Captured bazookas were immediately sent to German research centres in Kummersdorf and Hillersleben. Engineers studied them intensely, impressed by their simplicity. Within months, the Raketenpanzerbüchse 54, nicknamed the Panzerschreck, tank terror, appeared, an enlarged copy firing an 88mm rocket. It was heavier, more powerful, and devastating at short range. Ironically, the weapon that once made German armor vulnerable now armed their own infantry against Allied tanks. It was a cycle of innovation born from fear and necessity, a testament to how quickly warfare evolved under pressure. To German crews, however, the psychological damage was done. Confidence, once their greatest armor, had cracked. Every village, every hedgerow, every window could hide a man with a tube that could end them in seconds. The bazooka's true genius wasn't only in its design, it was in how fast it could be produced. In 1942, American industry was already in overdrive. Aircraft, tanks, rifles, all were being stamped, welded, and shipped at an unprecedented rate. The bazooka fit perfectly into this machine of mass production. It used simple materials: steel tubing, aluminum, wood, and a battery cell. By late 1943, over 450,000 launchers and 15 million rockets had rolled off American assembly lines. The weapon was cheap, easy to train with, and light enough to carry anywhere. Its portability also changed how armies thought about mobility and firepower. Infantrymen no longer needed to wait for tanks to handle enemy armor. The front lines became fluid. Squads could attack, defend, or ambush on their own terms. This independence redefined small unit tactics, and beyond the US, the bazooka spread like wildfire. The British received thousands under Lend-Lease, using them alongside their own Piat launchers. Even Soviet units received shipments, though they preferred their rugged anti-tank rifles. The world was watching the birth of a new kind of weapon, one that could fit in a truck and change the course of a battle. For years, the German Wehrmacht had relied on the myth of invincibility. Their panzers, Panzer IVs, Tigers and Panthers, were symbols of unstoppable power. The Blitzkrieg campaigns across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union had proven it. But war is as much psychological as it is physical. When the bazooka appeared, it struck at that myth. It showed the world that even the most powerful machines could be undone by ingenuity and courage. Tank crews began to alter their behavior. They refused to enter towns without infantry cover. They kept hatches closed, fearing surprise attacks. The once bold, armoured thrusts now slowed to cautious advances. Fear seeped into tactics, and with it came hesitation, the deadliest enemy of all. For Allied soldiers, the opposite occurred. Morale soared. They believed, truly believed, that they could stop anything. And belief is what wins wars as much as bullets do. The bazooka changed more than the battlefield. It changed how men felt on that battlefield. It shattered the hierarchy of power, reminding both sides that courage and creativity could outweigh steel and arrogance. From the engineers' benches of Aberdeen to the smoking fields of Normandy, the bazooka had proven its worth. But its greatest test was yet to come, when entire armoured divisions clashed in the open fields of Europe, and infantry armed with little more than tubes and nerves would decide the outcome. The invasion of Normandy wasn't just a battle for the beaches, it was a battle for ground, hedgerow by hedgerow, farm by farm, and for the first time, German armour met American infantry carrying the weapon they had mocked months before. The panzers rolled in with confidence. Panzer IVs and Tigers thundered through narrow lanes, their engines roaring like mechanical beasts. The hedgerows, thick, ancient earth walls lined with trees, created natural ambush sites. American troops, pinned down by machine gun fire, could hear the tanks coming long before they saw them. In one such field near St. Lo, a squad of the US 29th Infantry Division waited. They'd been issued the new M9A1 bazooka, improved with better sights and a longer tube. The men had drilled for weeks. But this was no exercise. The ground shook. A Tiger tank appeared, black smoke rising from its exhausts. Its cannon fired once. A farmhouse vanished in flame. The squad leader barked orders. 2 men crawled forward through the grass. They waited until the tank's flank passed within 40 yards. The loader whispered, "Now!" The gunner rose, shouldered the tube, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket hissed, a white trail cutting across the air. The impact was immediate. The shaped charge exploded, focusing its molten jet into a narrow point. Inside the Tiger, sparks burst from the armor's inner surface. Ammunition ignited. The turret locked. The machines stopped. The infantry erupted in disbelief. The impossible had happened. The Tiger, the terror of Europe, lay dead from a weapon that weighed less than a rifle squad's machine gun. Word spread quickly across the front. The Americans had a weapon that worked. German commanders took notice and ordered their tank units to alter tactics, increasing distance from infantry and avoiding close terrain. But the terrain of France gave no room to maneuver. The hedgerows belonged to the infantry, and the bazooka made them kings of that battlefield. By late July 1944, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. The skies roared with thunderbolts and mustangs, while on the ground columns of Shermans pushed forward. Yet, in every field, German panzers fought back with desperate precision. Operation Cobra, the plan to punch through German defences and open the way to Paris, faced fierce resistance. The Wehrmacht's Panzer-Lehr division, elite and heavily armoured, counterattacked repeatedly. In one encounter near Le Désert, German tanks pushed deep into American lines. Infantrymen of the 2nd Armoured Division found themselves cut off. Tanks were scarce. Air support was delayed. They relied on bazookas. Teams of 2 darted between shell craters, stalking panzers at ranges under 100 feet. They fired, reloaded, fired again. Smoke filled the fields. The air reeked of cordite and burning fuel. One after another, German tanks fell silent. Engines seized, turrets jammed, hatches flung open as crews bailed. The Americans advanced, not because they had more tanks, but because they had the courage to stand their ground with those green tubes on their shoulders. By the end of Operation Cobra, the myth of German armour's invulnerability was shattered beyond repair. Reports from field commanders confirmed it. Infantry can now destroy tanks without artillery or armour support. That single sentence rewrote decades of military doctrine. For the first time in modern warfare, man-portable anti-tank power had become a decisive force, one capable of stopping or even reversing an armoured offensive. The Germans would adapt, of course. They always did. But by the time their countermeasures arrived, the tide of war had already turned, and the weapon they had once laughed at was rewriting history. The Ardennes, winter 1944. Bazookas in the snow. The dawn of December 16, 1944, was silent. Far too silent. The dense forests of the Ardennes lay draped in snow, their stillness masking one of the largest German offensives of the war. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Columns of panthers, tigers and king tigers rolled through the woods under cover of darkness. Their goal, split the Allied lines and reach the port of Antwerp. Once again, the weight of German steel thundered westward. For American infantry caught in the opening assault, the situation was desperate. Many units, like the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, were under strength, exhausted, and lacking heavy armour. They had little more than rifles, machine guns, and bazookas. But this time, the bazooka was no longer an untested weapon. The men trusted it. They had learned how to ambush, how to use terrain, how to wait. In small Belgian towns like Saint-Vith and Bastogne, bazooka teams became legends. At Saint-Vith, a 2-man crew from the 23rd Armoured Infantry Battalion destroyed 3 Panthers within minutes by firing from concealed cellar windows. Each rocket struck the thinner side or rear armour, turning the narrow streets into graveyards of steel. At Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division held their perimeter with everything they had, including dozens of bazookas. When German tanks tried to encircle the town, they were met not by other tanks, but by men firing from foxholes, windows, and frozen ditches. The Germans were stunned. The cold was their enemy, the terrain their trap, and now even the infantry they once brushed aside could burn through their armour. Reports to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht described heavy losses inflicted by portable American anti-tank weapons at close range. The winter offensive failed, not just because of weather, fuel shortages, or air power, but because every advance came under fire from hidden men with weapons that ignored the old rules of war. While Europe's forests burned, another front was writing its own chapter in the bazooka's legacy. In the rocky hills of Italy, where narrow passes and ruined towns limited tank movement, American and British troops relied on the bazooka to clear pillboxes and armoured positions. It became a multi-role weapon, not just for tanks, but for bunkers, walls, and even sniper nests. In the Pacific, it faced a different kind of war. Against Japanese defences where tanks were rare but fortifications were dense, the bazooka's shape-charge warhead proved devastating. US Marines used it to crack open concrete bunkers and cave entrances on Saipan and Iwo Jima. Though Japanese tanks were lighter, like the Type 95 Hago, the bazooka tore through them effortlessly. Its psychological effect on Japanese troops mirrored that of the Germans months earlier. Disbelief, then dread. And by 1945, the weapon had evolved again. The M20 Super Bazooka, firing a larger 3.5-inch rocket, entered development. It would see use after the war, in Korea, but its roots were born in these frozen and sun-scorched battlefields of World War II. The bazooka had proven universal, adaptable to any terrain, any climate, any enemy. It turned ordinary soldiers into tank killers. Before the bazooka, infantry were expected to follow tanks. They protected armour, not destroyed it. But the war had changed. Armoured dominance could no longer be taken for granted. Commanders realized that mobility and firepower now belonged to small, agile teams. Entire field manuals were rewritten, platoons reorganized around anti-tank squads. Engineers developed new rocket types, new launchers, and training programs that emphasized ambush tactics and coordination. For the Germans, it was a lesson learned in blood. The introduction of their own Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust showed that they had grasped the new balance of power, but too late. Production shortages, fuel crises, and Allied air superiority meant that their countermeasures could only delay defeat, not prevent it. The battlefield of 1945 no longer resembled that of 1939. Tanks still mattered, but they no longer ruled alone. The infantryman, once seen as secondary to the machine, now carried the power to stop it cold. The bazooka had not only pierced armour, it had pierced the very foundation of how wars were fought. The roar of engines would fade in the final months of the war, replaced by the hum of factories designing what came next. Yet even as peace approached, the lessons of those who held the bazooka in mud, snow, and fire would shape every conflict to follow. By the spring of 1945, the myth of German invincibility had dissolved in fire and ruin. What began as a confident blitzkrieg in 1939 had ended in shattered tank husks strewn across Europe. From the ruins of France to the snow of the Ardennes, German crews learned that armour, no matter how thick, could not guarantee survival. Reports from the Panzertruppen painted a grim picture. Entire companies were lost not to massed artillery or bombing runs, but to small teams of infantry armed with weapons light enough to carry in a backpack. The Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, issued urgent memoranda demanding tactical reforms, tighter coordination with infantry, more reconnaissance, more caution in urban terrain. But by then, it was too late. The bazooka and its German counterparts had rewritten the tempo of the battlefield. A captured Wehrmacht colonel reportedly told his interrogators, "The tank is still king, but now the kingdom has walls everywhere." Those walls were men. Soldiers who could hide in rubble, strike from shadows, and vanish. It was no coincidence that late-war German tank designs like the Panzerausfuss Vers F and Maus experimented with heavier armour and improved optics. Engineers were racing to defend against an enemy that could appear anywhere. Yet these machines, monstrous in design, arrived too late, and too few. The Reich's war industry, shattered by Allied bombing and fuel shortages, could no longer adapt. The bazooka had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of a strategic truth Germany had failed to anticipate, that agility, not mass, would define the wars of the II future. For the United States, the bazooka's success carried both tactical and psychological consequences. It had given ordinary infantrymen the power to face tanks head-on. The feeling that they could stand their ground without waiting for armour or air cover changed morale across the European theatre. Soldiers no longer saw themselves as pawns under the shadow of enemy tanks. They were equals, capable of meeting steel with fire. Commanders took note. By 1945, bazooka teams were standard in every US rifle platoon. Training emphasized mobility, teamwork, and rapid ambush strikes. Manuals described tank hunting as an expected infantry skill, not a specialized task. And in combat, that shift was visible. In the ruins of Cologne, in the fields near the Rhine, and amid the factories of the Ruhr, bazookas were used not only to destroy tanks, but to breach walls, silence machine gun nests, and disable armored cars. The weapon had evolved beyond its purpose. It had become the infantry's universal equalizer. After the war, American analysts studied the results carefully. They realized the bazooka wasn't perfect. Its short range and limited penetration against heavy armor posed problems, but its strategic impact was undeniable. It had changed the psychology of warfare. Soldiers expected versatility now. They demanded it. In factories and think tanks, designers began envisioning the next generation, weapons with greater range, higher accuracy, and improved explosive power. The seeds of post-war rocket infantry doctrine were already sprouting. The close of World War II did not end the debate. It began a new one. How do you design a tank in a world where a man with a tube can destroy it? The question haunted militaries on both sides of the emerging Iron Curtain. Soviet engineers studied the bazooka's mechanics and produced their own, the RPG-2, then the iconic RPG-7. The British refined their Payat. The Germans' Panzerschreck directly influenced rocket design across Europe. Every major power sought the same answer: how to preserve the tank's dominance in an age of portable firepower. The answer came in layers: reactive armor, spaced plating, and eventually composite designs like the Chobham armor decades later. But all of that began here. In the muddy fields of France and the frozen forests of Belgium, where the first bazooka rounds found their mark. The ripple effect was immediate and irreversible. The age of pure armor was over. The age of combined arms, where infantry, armor, and air worked as one, had begun. And yet, the story doesn't end with victory or defeat. It ends with reflection on what the weapon revealed about men, machines, and the fragile balance between them. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world stood in awe of its own creations. Entire cities lay in ruins, but the weapons that had won the war became the blueprints for the next one. Among them, the bazooka stood out. Not for its size or complexity, but for what it symbolized: power in the hands of the common soldier. Within months of the German surrender, captured and reverse-engineered bazookas began circulating across the globe. The Soviets, impressed by its efficiency, refined their own versions using simpler manufacturing techniques. By 1949, the RPG-2 was in service, a direct descendant of the American design. Meanwhile, in the United States, engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground and the Army's Ordnance Department were already pushing forward. Their new creation, the M20 Super Bazooka, doubled the weapon's effective range and could punch through up to 11 inches of armor. It arrived too late for World War II, but just in time for Korea. On the Korean peninsula, US soldiers found themselves facing Soviet-made T-34S-85 tanks. Once again, infantrymen crouched in foxholes and frozen rice paddies, taking aim through the cold mist. And once again, the bazooka answered, proving that its legacy was far from over. Its story had transcended one war, one continent, even one generation. Beyond strategy and technology, the bazooka left a mark on culture itself. It became a symbol of ingenuity, of underdog defiance, of the idea that one man could stand against overwhelming odds. In newsreels and posters, the image of the soldier with a bazooka on his shoulder became iconic, the face of American adaptability. Newspapers called it the soldier's tank, while the German press, even in defeat, acknowledged its devastating simplicity. It also redefined how nations viewed research and development. The bazooka had been born not from massive government programs, but from a few persistent minds, men like Edward G. Uhl and Leslie Skinner, who believed that small, cheap innovations could change everything. That lesson spread far beyond the battlefield. It fueled post-war scientific ambition, from jet engines to rockets, inspiring an era where practical genius mattered more than prestige. Even the word bazooka entered everyday language, slang for strength, audacity, and impact. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a metaphor for sudden power. But history never celebrates innovation without consequence. For every German tank destroyed, there were crews inside, men who had believed in their armor as their salvation. For every American who fired the weapon, there was the moral weight of what that power meant. The bazooka democratized destruction. It allowed courage and terror to exist in the same breath. In giving infantry the power to challenge machines, it blurred the line between hunter and hunted. And as armies embraced it, so too did insurgents and revolutionaries. By the 1950s and beyond, variants and copies appeared in conflicts across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Guerrillas and militias carried them as equalizers against stronger foes, just as GIs once had in Normandy. What had begun as a weapon of liberation became, in WWII, time a symbol of rebellion. The same technology that helped defeat tyranny would later arm those fighting it, and those perpetuating it. It was the paradox of human progress. Every tool of survival becomes, inevitably, a tool of power. In the end, the bazooka's story was not only about steel melting under fire, it was about the courage that carried it and the ingenuity that built it. It showed that innovation was not confined to laboratories or command centers, but born from necessity, from the mud, fear, and desperation of men who refused to yield. When historians look back on the Second World War, they often speak of tanks, aircraft, and grand strategy. But in the silent spaces between those stories lies something deeper, the tale of how a few pounds of steel, wire, and explosive changed the rhythm of war. The bazooka didn't just pierce armor, it pierced the illusion that power belonged only to those who built the biggest machines. It restored balance, not by might, but by mind. From the shattered villages of Normandy to the icy forests of the Ardennes, its hiss still echoes, a reminder that innovation, once unleashed, never sleeps. The battlefield of World War II was not just a contest of armies, it was a crucible of ideas. From radar to rockets, every invention changed how men lived, fought, and died. But few inventions spoke so clearly to the dual nature of progress as the bazooka. It was the simplest of designs: a tube, a trigger, a spark, and a shaped charge. Yet it overturned doctrines that had dominated warfare for decades. It taught the world that no armor was absolute, no machine invulnerable, and no empire untouchable. It also reminded us of something deeper, that innovation is born not in comfort, but in crisis. The bazooka wasn't conceived in a grand laboratory. It was assembled by soldiers and engineers solving a problem in the field. That spirit, practical, desperate, and human, is what ultimately won the war. But its legacy is more than technical. It changed the psychology of combat. For the first time, a single soldier could challenge a tank, a symbol of industrial dominance. It redefined courage, no longer measured by scale, but by ingenuity. And in that sense, the bazooka became more than a weapon. It became a message that even in an age of giants, kite of steel titans, massive armies, and sprawling empires, the smallest idea, in the right hands, could level the field. The German tank crews who once laughed at the crude American tube learned that lesson too late. But history remembers not who laughed first, but who adapted fastest. In the end, the bazooka was not a story of destruction, but of balance. It was the moment when technology gave power back to the individual, when invention became a form of resistance. And in that quiet truth lies the real victory. That the measure of power is not how much you can destroy, but how much you can change. The tank ruled the first half of the war, one veteran said years later. The man with the bazooka ruled the second. The age of giants had ended, and from its ashes the age of ingenuity began.